For those of you who are just joining us, this is the Diane and Adam E. Max Conference on Women's History. I am Valerie Paley, the Senior Vice President, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library here at New York Historical, and most importantly for today, the founding Director of the Center for Women's History. I'd also like to acknowledge, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge also our wonderful visionary CEO of New York Historical, Louise Mirror. The center, which has only been in existence for about 9 or less years, was her brainchild, and we've been so fortunate to be able to carry it out with such great success and aplomb. So thank you all for being here. So welcome to our last panel of the day, a keynote conversation on the complexities of care as it is embodied and experienced from the violent and arresting history of American gynecology to the legal regulation of intimate life today. Please join me in welcoming Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is an award-winning author, historian, and reproductive justice advocate at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Cooper Owens is the author of Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology. Melissa Murray is the Frederick I. and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. Murray serves as a legal analyst for MSNBC and is a co-host of Strict Scrutiny, a podcast about the Supreme Court. Murray clerked for Sonia Sotomayor, then a judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Our moderator is a great friend to the Center for Women's History, Erin Carmone, in her 9th appearance at the Max Conference. She was here at the inception, and she's here today. She's a senior correspondent at New York Magazine, where she covers gender, law, politics, and more. She is the co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, Notorious RBG, The Life and Times of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her next book, currently in progress, will be Unbearable, Being Pregnant in America. Please welcome our panelists.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be at another Max conference, and I'm even more pleased to be sharing the stage with two scholars, intellectuals, historians, thinkers who I have learned so much from over the years in the course of covering reproduction. It's never not relevant to focus on reproduction in America, but the last couple of weeks have brought us a particularly acute, let's call it a new turn in reproduction. So I wanted to start there because I think we're with two people who can help us understand beyond the blaring headlines, help put in historical context, and also help us understand the strategies behind a particular restriction that's happened in Alabama on reproductive care. And that is, of course, I think probably everyone in this room has heard about the Alabama State Supreme Court issuing a ruling in response to a wrongful death claim, among other damage claims, brought by couples whose embryos were damaged in a negligent accident, let's call it, who sought for these embryos to have the status of children. And the Alabama State Supreme Court, of course, eagerly took up this assignment, and then some, referring to extrauterine children, building on prior cases, which we could talk about, and promptly, effectively banned IVF in the state of Alabama, something that we have not seen before, even in all of the dramatic legal and practical changes that have been enacted since the Dobbs decision in the United States. I was really interested in this decision for lots of reasons. One of them is that my book, I've been doing a lot of reporting on Alabama. I mentioned to you, Professor Cooper Owens, that I've been relying on your book and your analysis in great measure in understanding the history of this kind of reproductive care. And in particular, whose labor has been foundational to our understandings of gynecology and obstetrics, and whose reproduction is protected, celebrated, deemed worthy of outrage. So I guess I want to start with asking you what your reaction to the ruling was and how you read it based on your scholarship.
Thank you. First, I am really grateful to be sharing space with these two women, and also to the New York Historical Society for asking me to be a part of this conversation. It's interesting. There's very little that shocks someone who studies U.S. slavery in the 18th and 19th century. I often joke, I was a professor at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, for 5 years. So there's very little that shocks me. I'll just say that. I made my escape, intentional language, to New York after that. And so I was not shocked. I was simply disappointed again, because Alabama has been being Alabama for a really long time. And so by that, I'll paint a historical picture. I wrote a book that talks about the development of American gynecology and obstetrics. And I begin in the late 18th century, but primarily focus on the 19th century. Alabama comes up again and again, largely because of a man named James Marion Sims, who became known as the father of American gynecology after his death, and his experimentation on enslaved women in the 1840s. So Alabama has real roots in this kind of inequitable treatment of its citizens, of the people who live there when it comes to reproductive work. I'm not going to say care. The Supreme Court made a ruling based on something that was really exceptional in terms of gross negligence. I had IVF twice. It is really rare for someone to come in who is not a medical practitioner and touch the container where embryos are held. So that's rare and exceptional. And the Supreme Court also made a ruling calling embryos children when no one who has custodial oversight of an actual child would put them in sub-zero, freezing temperature. So there's that, right? There's that. But it's always been politics over people in terms of the state of Alabama, and there's so many like them. And that doesn't mean that Alabama is exceptionally cruel. I don't want to make that kind of misrepresentation. But Alabama is steeped in a kind of medical legacy of neglect and racism and elitism and classism. It is a state that has one black midwife, and the state is doing everything it can to dismantle the practice of midwifery. Everything it can to not ensure that birthing centers are there. So Alabama becomes, I think, a really wonderful state to study if we are really interested in the inequities around reproductive treatment. And I would say, to quote my dear friend and colleague, Donna Aeen Davis, reproductive injustice.
I wonder if you could tease out a little bit more, because, there was a significant amount of outrage, of course, when abortion was banned in all of these states. It did not go unnoticed, and it still continues to motivate voters. It still keeps some legislators on the defense. People are still working really hard to help abortion patients. They haven't been forgotten. But the extent to which Republicans have felt like they need to distance themselves, obviously, not all fertility patients are white or wealthy, but it is a treatment that is financially inaccessible to the vast majority of people. So I wonder, you hinted at it, and I wonder if you could help me by spelling it out a little bit. When you talk about the reproductive injustice, is it fair to say, do you think that this decision elicited a different level of outrage or surprise because of who it primarily affected?
Yeah, this is the interesting thing. So you and I met about 10 years ago when I was still in Mississippi, and it was around the Personhood Amendment. So I had been doing some reproductive justice work around that issue. And so Mississippi was attempting, like Alabama, to say that personhood started at the moment of conception. So at the moment of conception, that was a child. And so anyway, it failed in the state of Mississippi, which was actually surprising. The thing is, though, we had traditional conservatives in Mississippi who were quite adamant that IVF be protected because of the notion of family values. it also became apparent to me how IVF treatment in this country works, that it is not meant for people who don't have money. So I was a professor, assistant professor at Queens College, which is a part of the CUNY system. And when my husband and I decided to go through IVF, because we were a part of the CUNY system, essentially we didn't have to pay health care because it was included in our union fees. We had to switch to another insurance company. And so to come from paying nothing to $840 a month. I was an assistant professor. My husband was adjuncting and had a string of low-wage earning jobs working in various museums in the city, not the New York Historical Society. It decimated us financially, decimated us. And then you were told you had 3 rounds. I only went through 2 because we couldn't afford it anymore. And so that's when I realized that even as a married person, a person with a PhD, a person who, according to the Department of Labor, was middle class, IVF still wasn't meant for me. And so I had to go all the way to Coney Island, like near that area, which was a 30-minute drive every day to get my treatment, because it was one of the few places in the 5 boroughs that allowed people to get grants. So they were trying to be equitable. Every place else that was mentioned was on the Upper East Side, because it was considered like the best in the city. It wasn't necessarily the best for me, you know. And so IVF then has these supporters, much like the folk who are outraged in Alabama, who tend to be conservative because they see it as an outlet for creating, larger families, right? Larger traditional families.
Right. And they might be more likely to know an IVF patient than know that someone they know had an abortion.
Exactly.
One of the interesting antecedents of the Alabama decision, and I think that's absolutely right about the Mississippi personhood. I'm glad you brought that up, because it was supposed to be something that was kind of deadly to the anti-abortion movement, for someone to follow their thinking down the line such that it would affect people who needed IVF. That was supposed to be a bright line, but that bright line was not observed recently. And I'm glad that you mentioned it also, because the Alabama State Supreme Court had laid the groundwork for this personhood decision by ruling 10 years ago that a fetus or an embryo involved in a pregnancy was a child for the purposes of prosecuting people who use substances, at the time even prescription substances, during their pregnancy. And I've been reporting on this for a while. There are jails full of pregnant and postpartum women in Alabama who did not get a quick legislative fix, who did not get national outrage when they were arrested, either because they used marijuana the day before they found out they were pregnant, or because they had a bona fide addiction problem. The law treats them all the same, punitively. Alabama accounts for half of the arrests in the country, almost, related to pregnancy. And we didn't hear those women be the ones who, were having tearful stories about moving their embryos. And I say this with deep sympathy for the people who are caught in the middle of this. But to your point about who is IVF for, how inaccessible it is to people who need it, and whose restricted reproductive access elicits different kinds of outrage. Melissa, I want to come to you because I've learned a lot about the strategies of the anti-abortion movement from your work, the strategies, the thinking. To what extent did the Dobbs decision lay the groundwork for this? I don't believe that there's been an appeal in the Alabama case, but I wonder if you could also help us understand, were the Supreme Court to consider this question of fetal personhood, where you think it would go.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here in conversation with all of you. I will also note the quick legislative fix that you referenced in Alabama, the law that was recently passed with bipartisan support in the state legislature. I believe it has a 2025 sunset clause where it has to be reissued, which is really interesting.
What's in 2025?
Well, I know it's in 2024.
An election.
Yeah, I think that might have something to do with it. So I think this quick legislative fix is truly going to be quick and maybe not a fix for everyone. But I don't think this case in particular is going to get to the Supreme Court because it involves so many specific questions of Alabama statutory and constitutional law. But even leaving that to the side for the moment, the court's decision in 2022 in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization draws a straight line between this notion of fetal personhood and the decision to restrict abortion access in the United States. And so I want to just make that very clear. The Dobbs opinion is replete with Easter eggs that gesture toward fetal personhood. The court routinely, in the opinion, refers to the unborn, refers to the idea that some among the polity view the fetus as unborn life, as an unborn person. That is a fetal personhood argument. And specifically in footnote 41 of the opinion, there is a really interesting discussion that Justice Alito launches in which he notes that several amici who filed briefs before the court in this case believe that those who favor liberal access to abortion, so everyone on the left, does so for the purpose of restricting African American reproduction. So this is a very sort of standard trope among many in the anti-abortion community, this idea of abortion as eugenics, as abortion as a tool of deracination aimed particularly at the African American community. It is a trope that has been husbanded by Justice Clarence Thomas in a 2019 shadow docket decision called Box versus Planned Parenthood of Indiana and Kentucky. He filed a concurring opinion to a dissent from the denial or from a denial of certiorari in which he chided his colleagues for refusing to grant certiorari on the view that this question of whether abortion served eugenic purposes needed to be answered. And if not now, then when? And it was coming back to this court and they would have to decide it sooner or later. And he then went on to craft a narrative in which he grafted the history of the anti-abortion or the history of the abortion access movement to the history of the birth control movement to the history of the eugenics movement in the United States. And these are all three very distinct histories and they don't necessarily overlap in the ways that he suggests. But his point was that Margaret Sanger, who was the pioneer of birth control access in the early 20th century, worked hand in glove with the eugenics movement, and she did so specifically for the purpose of citing birth control clinics in the African American community. And he talks specifically about a birth control clinic that was cited in Harlem. What he leaves out of this cobbled together history is that W.E.B. Du Bois worked with Margaret Sanger, and he did so specifically because the Black community believed very much that as African Americans made the transition from an agrarian life post-slavery to an industrial life in American cities, they would need to restrict the number of children that they had, or they would be financially and economically imperiled. And so the access to birth control was meant for the uplift of the Black community, not for its deracination. Justice Thomas spends very little time with that. Instead, it is this idea that abortion has quote-unquote eugenic potential and can deracinate. And this is embedded in footnote 41 in the Dobbs decision, and it doesn't actually have a really jurisprudential focus for the opinion. Roe and Casey are overruled in Dobbs because there is no textual right to an abortion in the Constitution, nor is the practice of abortion access deeply rooted in our history and traditions, according to Justice Alito. But if it doesn't serve a jurisprudential purpose, then I would argue that it serves a discursive purpose. And the purpose it serves is to lay the foundation for thinking about restrictions on abortion as anti-discrimination measures for the fetus. And if you think about the fetus as an entity that can be discriminated against, then you're halfway on your way to thinking about the fetus as a person. And you're 3/4 of the way toward thinking about the fetus as a discrete and insular minority, the type of entity that the court, through judicial review, is obliged to protect. Right? So once we are thinking about the fetus as a minority interest for whom the court is obliged to intercede to offer judicial protection from the vicissitudes of the majority, then any law that would expand abortion access is actually a law that is aimed at discriminating against the fetus and can be struck down, even if it is the product of a democratically conducted process, because the fetus is a minority interest. Right? So the idea of fetal personhood is built into Dobbs. Even as this court talks about the need to send the abortion question back to the states for democratic deliberation, too much democracy is going to be a problem. And the way to deal with states actually using democratic processes to enshrine and preserve abortion rights is to enshrine the fetus as a person for whom courts can now intercede. And that's the whole kit and caboodle. And it makes perfect sense, because if you are someone who believes that abortion is tantamount to murder, you can't be okay with Dobbs as a state-by-state settlement of this question. It can't be okay if abortion is murder if California allows murder. So this state-by-state settlement that the court suggested was what Dobbs was doing, that's never been the end goal. It's just a way station on the way to something more lasting, and that more lasting final destination is the moment where the fetus, whether by legislative fiat or judicial fiat, is recognized as a person for purposes of statutory and constitutional law.
So I'm once again going to ask one of my distinguished panelists to spell something out that could be numbingly obvious but just needs to be said. Where does that leave pregnant women or people who can become pregnant? All of this talk of fetal personhood does what?
I mean, you're Anarcha, you're Betsy,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
Lucy, you're the vessel.
Yeah. I mean, so there are so many things swimming in my head. First, I want to come back to that question, but I also, for the audience who might not know this, to really talk about Dobbs, but to talk about kind of what happened before. And then I promise I'll get to the question. So Dobbs was versus Jackson, Mississippi Women's Health Center. Jackson, Mississippi is a city that is about 80% plus black, so anywhere from 80 to 85%. This is what happened in the state of Mississippi when we were working on the Personhood Amendment. So the vote doesn't pass. Dobbs, who was, if I'm getting his title correct, I think he was like Secretary of Health or something for the state of Mississippi, goes to Governor Phil Bryant, well, then Governor Phil Bryant, the nephew of the men who killed Emmett Till, right? Just so you know. So he's the governor. They get together and they decide that they will launch a case that will go to the Supreme Court to abolish abortion in the United States. And what Melissa is talking about with footnote 41 with Clarence Thomas and this whole, kind of black genocide, I mean, I'm sounding very 1970s, right, at that point, but that's really this sense of these folk are trying to kill black people. Jackson Women's Health Center becomes very important because the assumption is it's all of these poor black women going into this center to get abortions so that their babies are killed, right? So this is really the impetus when we think about the historical context for how Dobbs happens out of that little state of Mississippi. So that's why I said, when you started this and said, are you shocked? No, I'm not shocked.
And who is enacting this supposed black genocide? I mean, the sort of implicit vilification of black women who have abortions.
Right.
Can you expand on it?
They're essentially co-conspirators
That's right.
in this racist plot hatched by Margaret Sanger and perpetuated by those who would seek liberal access to abortion to deracinate the black community. So black women are either unwitting dupes who just don't understand the consequences of their actions, or they are active co-conspirators, actively plotting against the best interests of their community. So that's a lot, and it's even more profound when you think about the fact at no point in the Dobbs decision, a decision that decimated abortion access in Mississippi and elsewhere, but Mississippi, which is, again, a predominantly black state, there's no mention of black women in that opinion. Not even from the dissenters. Like, Black women are utterly absent from this opinion, even though they will likely bear the brunt of that decision.
And again, it's my job to just kind of really spell out obvious things here. By putting on the mantle of the true anti-racist, what work are the Clarence Thomases of the world, but also their white co-conspirators, the Phil Bryants of the world? What are they doing? They are saying, we are the true anti-racists, while we are actually doing what?
While we are decimating Black communities. I mean, so all of us suffer. But if we think about the most marginalized and the poorest state in the nation, which is Mississippi, I always tell people this. This is where being a historian of the 19th century comes in really useful for these contemporary moments. Prior to the Civil War, Mississippi was the richest state in the nation because of slavery. And in fact, the Mississippi Secession Statement clearly states slavery is the greatest institution and investment. And then they give a whole scientific soliloquy, quite eloquent, about all the ways that none but the Negro can bear the hot sun and perform this kind of work in this tropical weather. After the Civil War, Mississippi becomes the poorest state and is the first state to enact Black laws that usher in Jim Crow. And they've been doing it ever since.
Let me add a little coda to that. One of my jobs as someone who studies constitutional law is not just to focus on reproductive rights and justice, but to sort of look at everything that the court is doing. And yes, this is a court that I think in many ways understands itself as woke warriors doing the real work of racial justice. We saw that in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, where the Chief Justice tells us, like, you know, if you want to stop racial discrimination, let's stop it right now. Let's end affirmative action in college admissions. I do believe the court understands itself as overturning these decisions in order to advance a vision of racial justice, but it's not the vision of racial justice I think the Warren Court might have embraced.
So you think it's sincere? You don't think it's just a kind of PR tactic?
No, I genuinely, let me say more. I do think that they understand themselves as having a remedial interest, correcting wrongs that had been created. I think the difference is their understanding of who the victims of racism are is really different from what the Warren Court had noted. So, you know, there are references to Brown versus Board of Education all over the Dobbs opinion, and the reference is very clear. It is meant to convey that Dobbs is like Brown, restoring order after the injustice of Plessy or Roe. Like, Roe and Plessy are the same in this capacity. I think the court does this in other places too, not just reproductive rights, but if you think about Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, if you think about the student loan case, where the beneficiaries of student loan forgiveness have been framed in the public imagination as mostly Black and brown student borrowers. The court invalidating the Biden plan to provide student loan relief is about restoring a sense of fairness to those who did not get the benefit of that government largesse, whether it was affirmative action or student loan relief. And those are principally white people. I mean, so I think one of the things that you see from this court is a commitment to remedying racial injustices that have been done to minorities. It's that they see white people, working white people, Christian evangelicals, and fetuses as the true minorities. So, I mean, this is something I'm working on in a book, but I mean, this to me is the crux of it. They want to fulfill their role in vindicating the rights of discrete and insular minorities. It's just not the minorities that have been understood to be minorities in the past.
It's saving the innocent baby and killing the sinful criminal.
I mean, you see this in the way they approach religious freedom, right? And like the rights of Christian evangelicals in 303 Creative, the case about whether or not the website designer could refuse services to
Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
I mean, we were talking about this, the way that Alito writes about fetal personhood and Dobbs as this kind of, well, some people believe, I was thinking about the way he wrote about certain forms of contraception
Yes.
in Hobby Lobby.
Some people
Kind
believe
of
that they're
inserting in this
abortifacient.
notion that the most effective forms of contraception, if they could be hypothetically blocking the implantation of a fertilized egg, even though it's extremely unlikely and can't be shown by science, does that then lay the groundwork for restricting contraception as part of this whole panoply of reproductive control? They're doing it as kind of, some people say. Thinking about historian of the 19th century and the 19th century antecedents, and you had mentioned the kind of the process arguments that are not so convincing about Roe. One of the people who said that he really did think that there needed to be a state-by-state solution was one Brett Kavanaugh. In his concurrence in Dobbs, he said, California has this. I forget what state he said. Alabama has that. Mississippi has that. Maybe it was Mississippi because they were the plaintiffs. He also said, ladies, don't worry. Freedom of travel is not at issue. So back in our friends in Alabama, the Attorney General issues an opinion saying that he has the right to prosecute people in Alabama who are performing the labor of helping abortion patients leave the state to obtain a procedure that is legal in the state of their destination. What historical and legal alarm bells does a move like that raise?
Access. I mean, so for me, I can't speak to the legal part, but I just think about access. This is a whole conference about care, right, and the margins. And so I think about the people who are performing care on the margins. And so who has access to the resources to be able to travel? Also, who has access to the resources that are educative to know where to travel? And you would also need access to have those kinds of up-to-minute updates around what's going on legally and what doctors can do. Because as we're seeing, things are changing almost in the blink of an eye, and I'm not being hyperbolic, right? And so it really is about, once again, the state intervening in the lives of women and birthing people, but looking at those who are on the margins, so they tend to be communities of color, they tend to be those who are economically, who are not economically enfranchised. We're also thinking about people in rural communities. I went to high school in the poorest county in the state of South Carolina. When I graduated high school in 1990, we did not have a maternity ward. We do not have one now. And so you have to travel 13 miles to go to the hospital in the next town, which is in another county. And so it's affecting those kinds of people, right? You can't just go to the CVS at any point and get Plan B when the CVS closes at 5 or 6 p.m. in these places. So once again, it's about
Or
access.
a pharmacist is going to deny you
Right, and
the
this
pill.
is where, I think this was the brilliance of Black women who created the term reproductive justice, because it was about more than just abortion. They were saying access has to be the concept that's centered, right? And we're seeing this repeated, from the foresight of these women in 1994 when they coined this term, that it really is about access.
Right, yes, and I just, to clarify my point too, and I think what you say is so important, there are incredible and brave people who are living in these banned states who are doing what they can with very few resources to try to help people get that access, who are now facing, in places like Texas as well, different layers of civil or criminal liability for helping people leave. To me, when I hear restriction on interstate travel, going from a banned state to a free state, I don't want to be facile about it, which is why I put it to you. I think about people leaving slave states.
Yeah.
There are so many historical antecedents. People don't think about this, but Loving versus Virginia was decided in 1967. Among the things the Lovings were convicted of and for which they appealed their conviction was that not only did they choose to marry interracially. They left the state of Virginia to do so in DC, where it was legal, and then they returned. And one of the laws that they violated was leaving the state to evade the ban on miscegenation, which incidentally had been promulgated in the 1920s during a fit of eugenic fervor. I mean, there's the real eugenics movement in action. So there are lots of historical antecedents for this. It could be very easily done, and it has been done. The point of this, though, is to isolate the pregnant person and to dismantle whatever scaffolding a pregnant person can put around themselves in order to get the care that they want and need. That's why Texas SB 8 was promulgated, this bounty hunter law that was created by Jonathan Mitchell. He was also the individual who recently argued the disqualification hearing at the United States Supreme Court on behalf of Donald Trump. He's the architect of this bounty hunter law that essentially makes it a crime, or allows individuals, private persons, to bring a civil cause of action against anyone who facilitates a pregnant person seeking an abortion, whether that is the Uber driver, the person who loans them money, whatever. It's to isolate and to leave that person alone without any mechanism of support, to the point where you just acquiesce and you're like, okay, I guess I'm having this baby. And that's the point of it. You mentioned Brett Kavanaugh. I love talking about Brett Kavanaugh. I really do.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I testified against Brett Kavanaugh and was asked in the Senate Judiciary Committee, do you think he will be a vote to turn over Roe versus Wade? He said no. And I'm like, of course he will be. And I said, emphatically, he will be. And he went and I would never do that. Roe is precedent. In fact, it's precedent on precedent. And here we are. So I'll just say.
And the New York Times actually reported that he was the one he kind of framed Amy Coney Barrett because he was the one pushing to do it all and not just the 15-week ban.
Right.
So not only did he vote for it, he zealously advocated for it behind the scenes.
No, yes, his fingerprints are everywhere. I will just say, you could fill a book with the silly things that Brett Kavanaugh has said. And one of the silly things is in that Dobbs concurrence, in which he talks about, everyone has this right to travel interstate to seek whatever care they want. Abortion was a right that was not enumerated in the Constitution, and it was invalidated and withdrawn on the basis of it being unenumerated and not deeply rooted in the history and tradition of this country. The right to travel is nowhere explicit in the text of the Constitution, and it seems entirely that this question of what is or is not deeply rooted in the history and tradition of this country is a question that 6 unelected lawyers get to decide for themselves. So I wouldn't put much stock in Brett Kavanaugh's view that we have wide and unfettered freedom to move around the country seeking health care. And it also leaves out the fact that there can be action on the federal level that could make this state-by-state settlement absolutely moot. If there is a Republican president, if there is a Republican Congress, there will be a national ban on abortion. Full stop. You heard it here. I haven't been wrong once on any of these things I've predicted. Not once. Even if they aren't able to get a national ban, what is lying in the wings is the 1873 Comstock Act. This was a law passed at the height of the Victorian era. It prohibits the transmission in interstate commerce of articles intended for quote-unquote immoral purposes. That included contraception, information about contraception, abortifacients, and it's never been repealed. It's not being used, but it's never been repealed, which means it's lying in a state of desuetude like a zombie and can be revivified at any time. And Jonathan Mitchell, who again, I love talking about him too, he said in the New York Times last week that he really hopes Donald Trump does not know about the Comstock Act because he'll start talking about it, and then people will realize the Comstock Act is on the books and that they don't even need a national ban to stop the transmission of medication abortion across state lines. All they need to do is get into office, just the executive would be enough, and they could have the Department of Justice begin prosecuting and enforcing under the Comstock Act. So they don't even need both houses of Congress. They just need to gain the presidency.
I like how Jonathan Mitchell in this is like a cartoon villain explaining
like
exactly his plan.
Like stroking a mustache.
But I guess nobody will pay attention unless it's Trump saying it.
But again, I thought it was I was like, I can't believe you're telling this
Just
to the
gave
New
up
York
the game.
Times. But but that's the game. Like, so Comstock is out there, an actual national legislative ban is out there. Like, we are literally slouching towards Gilead.
So nationwide, since Dobbs, the abortion rate has actually slightly ticked up, probably because of the Herculean efforts of people expanding access, whether it's right at the borders of states, mail order abortion, both through legal and extra legal mechanisms. But as you mentioned, Professor Cooper Owens, a lot of people are left behind in these situations. You mentioned birth justice earlier, and I know that you speak a lot with birth workers, reproductive justice advocates who are working on the birth end of things. For people who are consigned to continue a pregnancy that they would have, had they had access, not, or people who would like to be pregnant and are subject to a cruel and uncaring system. I wonder if you could lay out a little bit, what you hear from people who are working with birthing people on the grounds, and also just what is the landscape in these places, these same places that have restricted abortion and would like to restrict a lot more, for people who are then forced to stay pregnant against their will. What are they looking at?
Ooh, that's tough. So I've done work in Mississippi, New York, Nebraska, where I just moved from 6 months ago. And it was difficult because I was in Nebraska during the time of the Dobbs decision. And so the reproductive justice groups that I was a part of, I'll only name one. IB Black Girl is one. It's a Black woman-owned reproductive justice group. The other I will not because of the interstate travel. We had to really reconfigure how we were thinking about what reproductive care and reproductive justice looked like in a state that is looking for full stop abortion ban. And so what that meant was really relying on advocates, doing a lot of work with doulas. I would be remiss if I did not point out that we have someone in the audience, Denise Bowles, who was a former president of DONE, a national organization of doulas. So doing that kind of work.
And for those who might not be familiar with what a doula is,
A
do you mind
doula
explaining?
essentially advocates for pregnant people at every level. And there are some who do postpartum doula work as well. So we had to kind of reconfigure and transform our strategies to work with birth workers at every level. So from lactation specialists to pediatricians for newborns to midwives where there existed, doula workers, patient advocates or navigators. So that was the kind of work that we had to focus on for those who were keeping their pregnancies. Before then, it was really about accompanying people to the one Planned Parenthood in the state that provided abortion in Nebraska. I'm very new to Connecticut, so I don't know the intricacies yet. I'm not affiliated with any one organization there as of yet. But it has just been a different kind of strategy and conversation, and one that's also rooted in a secrecy that Laura talked about with the Jane Group in the late 60s and 70s. And so that's why I'm really hesitant to mention the name. And it was also a group that was comprised of men, women, people of different faiths, no faith, and so it was a really interesting kind of congregation of us doing this work and then having to stop that work and really be rooted in a kind of secret strategy around pregnancy and what that means. Because I was also in a state, and I'll be quiet, but also in a state that had also voted to reduce funding for children's lunch during the summer. So it's like, wait, you want people to have children, you want mothers to care, mothers, not parents, mothers, to provide the kind of domestic care for these children, but you don't want to feed their children. Got it.
Right.
Well, I think that's a point that's worth teasing out. I mean, one of the most confounding aspects of the anti-abortion movement in this country, and is the degree to which it is also nested in this ethic of neoliberalism and this complete antipathy for redistribution. Right? So, yes, have all the children, but we are not going to do paid family leave.
Nope.
We are not going to provide universal health care. We are not going to provide health care just for children, or we're going to resist it to the degree that we can. I mean,
We're going to throw birthing people off their Medicaid
Yeah.
30 or 60 days immediately after.
again, I mean, it comes back to, again, the fundamental antipathy for redistribution and a system of public life in which the family absorbs all of the dependency of its individual members. And that model only works if women don't work.
That's right.
And so it all syncs up. I mean, like it's completely coherent if you think about it. Men with jobs, like the discussion of like, a working wage, all of that makes sense. Like I'm reminded of Alice Kessler Harris's work. Women who can be supported by their male breadwinning husbands and who have as many children as possible, all supported by this family breadwinner. It doesn't make sense in this particular moment in which we are living, in which most families have to have two breadwinners, but it's fine if you generally believe that half the families don't warrant your attention anyway. And this goes to the part that Deirdre's been talking about. Like, it's also steeped in this, not just antipathy for redistribution, but a sense that the people who are receiving redistribution are the people who are not like us, that we don't want to have because it's unfair or it's unjust. And this goes back to my point about whose interests are being vindicated here. It's restoring the America that once was. All of this is part of that.
Right, and I grant your point completely about, what's the ideal vision of family implied by this harsh neoliberal frame. And I guess I would say that the other side of that coin is keeping people abject, giving them no choice over the trajectory of their lives, keeping them in poverty so that they are more acquiescent to that system, so that it is more difficult for them to have any leverage or any control over the course of their lives, and
no mobility.
Yeah.
I mean, like part of it is the mobility that has existed in our society over the last 2 generations, right? That threatens a hierarchy where those who have traditionally been at the top enjoyed that status and never had any expectation of falling below it. I mean, if you think about just the political rhetoric that we're hearing, like, make America great again, this is what it's hearkening back to. We want that hierarchical society, but we want to be at the top again.
Right, and one of the mechanisms for enacting it is even more reproductive control.
More reproductive control. I mean, again, this is an assault on women's bodies for sure, but it's not just about reproduction. I mean, if you think about what happened on January 6, 2021, there is a connection there. So I was doing a panel with a physician who works in Texas, and she was telling me, on January 5th, 2021, we came to the office, and it was so weird. All of the people who usually protest weren't there. And our patients walked in, never had a problem. We provided care, they left, it's fine. The next morning, same thing, they weren't there. And people just came in and left, and it was fine. And then we turned on the TV at lunchtime in the break room, and we saw the siege of the Capitol. And we were like, hey, there's Johnny in the yellow jacket, who's always outside of our building. I don't think we understand the degree to which, and we have not reckoned with the degree to which, the assaults and the protests of abortion clinics were merely a dress rehearsal for January 6th. And I don't think we have reckoned with the degree to which January 6th was not just about protesting an allegedly stolen election or restoring one person to power. It was a response to a changing model of leadership in which the Speaker of the House was a woman, the new Vice President was a woman of color, and the Supreme Court was almost at near parity in terms of gender representation. If you think about it in that sense too, and you think about the rhetoric of that day, like people calling Nancy Pelosi a bitch and saying they were going to hunt for AOC, this is not just about an election, it is about the loss of a model of leadership in which certain men were at the top. And it's changing, and it's scary, and there's anxiety. All of these laws limiting reproduction have always been precipitated by profound demographic anxiety about the changing nature of this country. And that is a through line that runs through all of this.
I have a follow-up question that is a scary rejoinder to your scary picture, which is, it's an election year. What's at stake for everything that we're talking about this fall?
You're the political analyst. I always joke, I write and study about dead people who were doctors and nurses and patients.
You're going to be writing about this society in a few ways.
No, I will. I am, I can't necessarily say that in my 51, almost 52 years, that I've ever held great hope that the United States would be as equitable as it should be on any level. I am hopeful because of the birth workers and the reproductive justice advocates and activists that I see helping to change things systemically where they live. So, for instance, that means that in New York, there are partnerships between the city government and birth workers to ensure more equitable births. In larger cities, I am hopeful when I see the growth in the number of Black women, Indigenous women, and Spanish-speaking women who are becoming doulas and also entering into midwifery programs. In terms of the election, Lord knows, I try not to believe in nihilism, and I really don't want to believe in Black nihilism. I'm not hopeful. And so I have to keep my focus on the thing that I know a little bit more about. And so it's the birth workers, and it's the activists and the advocates who are really on the ground pushing us forward. My book was published in 2017. Literally now, when I go to speak to young people, I am amazed at how many of them are wanting to enter into reproductive medicine and reproductive care and do legal work around reproductive justice. That was not the case in 2017. I ran a medical humanities program, and I quit that because I needed to live a softer life where I wasn't working 3 jobs all the time, and now I just have 2. But when I was running the medical humanities program and doing that kind of work around the nation and in Nebraska, I was shocked at the number of mainly women, but also a smaller number of men who were interested in this kind of work as well. So that's what keeps me hopeful, that at least in this terrain that we're gathered here today, we can see some of the gains. There is a metric system for being able to see progress. Mm-hmm. I will turn the election to Melissa.
I'm glad you said that. Well, she told me she wanted to talk to the election, so she did that to you.
I will leave that.
Yeah, you told me that upstairs. Yeah. Believe me, I'm not hankering to talk about it. But I love that you said that, because you sort of alluded to it earlier, and I was hoping we'd have time to talk about it more, but we have about 5 minutes. But I think what you're talking about is people, especially in states where so much has been restricted, are also providing a model for continuing this work, no matter whether their values are represented in political office or not, whether democracy is functioning or not. They are continuing to pick up the pieces. Dobbs presented one of the worst case scenarios, not the only worst case scenario, for reproductive care and justice, and they are continuing to do the work that they're doing, reconfigured as you described. I profiled for New York Magazine Dr. Yashika Robinson, who was an abortion provider in Alabama who was the only one who provided second trimester abortions while also delivering babies, and is one of the people that you mentioned who is trying to partner with midwives and provide a place for black midwives to train and get hours by opening up a birth center. And again, it's just like, it's another one of these things where you think like, you say that you want there to be babies born, but they are restricting safe, evidence-based options that help limit maternal mortality and morbidity. Another way in which a cold neoliberal capitalistic frame, because it's taking business away from the doctors, let's be real, and this obviously has a deep history in America and beyond. The fact that they can continue to go up against these same powers, that same attorney general who threatened to prosecute people who help abortion seekers leave the state is the one preventing them from opening up the birth centers. That they can continue to do the work they do in the face of such cruel policies and politicians is really tremendous.
And if they can do that, we can do things too. I mean, we actually have to be able to do more than one thing at a time if we're going to live through this moment. You know, we have an election coming up. Lots of people are talking about how imperfect both of the candidates are, and that's probably been the case in almost every election. There is no perfect candidate. I will say that for me, this election is as much about the Supreme Court as it is about anything else. No one's talking about this, but Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas are both septuagenarians, and they don't want to step down during a Democratic presidency. They want to step down when there is a Republican because they know that Republican will replace them with fetuses or teenagers. And
So that's the fetal personhood thing.
that is the fetal personhood thing. I'm joking slightly, but it's true. Like, if there's a Republican president who wins in 2024, they will immediately announce their resignations from the court, and there will be immediately 2 vacancies to be filled, and they will be replaced by younger conservative judges. And this 6-3 conservative supermajority that gave us Dobbs will literally last a generation and a half longer than it already is slated to last, right? That's what's at stake. And in 2016, it was the exact opposite. We had on the ballot the opportunity to have a 6-3 liberal supermajority. And instead, we got Donald Trump, someone who did not win the popular vote, but who managed to appoint 3 justices to the court and gave us the court we have today. The question is going to be whether we have this court for the immediate moment or well into the future, and whether that 6-3 supermajority increases to a 7-2 supermajority. Reproductive rights and justice is deeply and inextricably intertwined with all of these other questions of democracy that are also on the ballot, and we can't lose sight of that. You mentioned the Mississippi Personhood Amendment. At the same time that so many reproductive rights and justice warriors were working to defeat the Personhood Amendment, there was also a voter bill on the ballot in Mississippi that would limit the individuals. It was a suppressive voter law, and it actually won in Mississippi. And it limited the way in which Mississippians could select members of their state legislature, the same legislature that in a few years would pass HB 1510, the law that was upheld in Dobbs. So these things are all connected. Like, it can't be that we are focused on personhood but not on the voting rights that are being suppressed. We have to do both at the same time. And we have to have stamina. This is a long haul. It's not just going to be this election. It's going to be the election after that, the midterm election, down ballot races. It matters who is an attorney general. It matters who's a state level prosecutor. It matters who's on your
on the
local
state
school
Supreme
board.
Court.
All of it matters. All of this matters, and we can't afford to be disengaged in any of it. Like, it really is an existential threat. I don't know how much more profound it can be. I know it sounds scary. It is scary. It's deeply scary, but all of it's on the ballot, and the Supreme Court is not coming to save us. Like, we have got to save ourselves.
Far from it. We need to be safe from them.
And just the one thing to add on, I think it's congruent. And I will go back to reproductive justice. The brilliance of this is it talks about everything that you're mentioning. The environment, it talks about food equity.
Guns.
It talks about everything, right? And so it's a framework that isn't just about reproductive medicine or rights or abortion, but it's talking about the world that we live in and people holistically. And so when I say it's the brilliance, if any of you have not read what these women created in 1994, please go back and read it, right? This is before intersectionality was a concept that, that anti-woke warriors were fighting about. It was contained in that concept of reproductive justice. And so it's speaking about all of this. And so when it talks about the kind of binding and the intersectionality of all of our identities, it means that we're working on all fronts to create the kind of world that is a bit more equitable, that can push the needle forward, and not be regressive. And I think that we're in this state. It's almost like, when slavery ends and then there's Reconstruction, and then those decades after, literally after Reconstruction. And I kind of see us, being embroiled in that political moment where people who are afraid of losing power and their status are hell-bent on trying to reconstruct a world that harkens back to when they were in power, in their minds, uncontested.
We are unfortunately out of time. I am so grateful to you both for your wisdom, your bracing honesty, your historical knowledge, the breadth of your analysis. Thank you so very much, and thank you to this audience.
Thank you so much for that incredible conversation. On behalf of the Center for Women's History, I want to thank all of today's participants, all of the panelists for these engaging conversations, and everyone in the audience for being here, and for anyone who watches these recordings later. In the wake of the pandemic, this imperative to reconsider how we value care on and off the clock has perhaps never been more pressing. We'd like to once again thank all of our wonderful donors and supporters who allow us to produce all of the wonderful content you see throughout the year. Their support enables us to show that women's history is American history, not only during the month of March, but every day of the year. The Center for Women's History presents a full calendar of women's history salons in addition to this annual conference, and we hope that you'll join us at some of our future events. This coming Friday, International Women's Day, will be in conversation with the Cherokee artist Kay Walking Stick, whose work is featured upstairs in our gallery on the second floor, and it's a Zoom program. Later this month, on March 21st, we'll be back on this stage in collaboration with WNYC to uncover the story of how women fought to be seen, heard, and treated for HIV/AIDS at a time when the disease was thought to only affect men. And later this summer, in July, we'll have a program on the stage as well in collaboration with the John and Alice Coltrane House, where we present a salon on Alice's musical legacy. So please sign up on the museum's mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org as we announce more programs this season. The Historical Society is open Tuesday through Sunday, and if you haven't had a chance to see our ongoing exhibit, Women's Work, upstairs on in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery, we hope that you'll be back with us soon. Now, I'd like to invite you all to please join us outside the auditorium doors for a reception, and cheers to continuing these critical conversations we've begun today, as well as to Women's History Month. Thank you all very much.